Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Backley and I'm the Associate Director at the British Chamber of Commerce here in Japan. I'd like to begin by thanking our partners who you will likely be able to see on the screen now, the Japan Society in the UK and the International Institute for Strategic Studies for collaborating with us today to deliver what's a very topical and will be a very insightful session. Brought back by popular demand, this global forecast has become a real staple and a favorite in the BCCJ calendar. And our panel today will share their takes on what we can expect over the year ahead and really unpack what's going on in the world globally and where and how Japan fits into this. The session will be recorded, but please feel free to submit your questions that you have for our panelists, either anonymously or publicly, either is fine. And Bill will do his best to get through as many as possible in the time that we have. We have a ton of great content to get through in the next 58 minutes. So I will swiftly pass over to lead the discussion today and to introduce our panelists to the very capable hands of Bill Emmett, who is the chairman of both the Japan Society in the UK and the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Over to you, Bill.
Well, thank you very, very much, Sarah, and good afternoon to everyone in Japan. Good morning to everyone in the UK. It is wonderful to be collaborating together again with BCCJ, and of course, internal in my head, I collaborate between the Japan Society and the IISS as chair of both. But it's also an incredibly momentous day for the world. A major war has commenced overnight on the continent of Europe with the full Russian invasion of Ukraine. Had we been holding this event even last week, but certainly last month, I've no doubt that in this event we would have been speculating as to whether there was going to be conflict in Ukraine. We would have been wondering about the effects of it. But I would guess that probably because of the uncertainties involved, it would have been, we're just simply one of a long list of possibilities. This is in a way surprising in retrospect, because Vladimir Putin made very clear in all sorts of speeches and articles what he was envisaging, and the American government has of course been continuously forecasting exactly this invasion, but nevertheless it was quite reasonable to believe that perhaps this was brinkmanship. So that is the background to a global forecast for Japan and the world in 2022. Obviously, an impact on economics, on the oil price immediately above $100 a barrel overnight, impact on economies and stock markets, impact on other energy prices, impact through the sanctions response that will follow from Western allies and from others, perhaps disruption in the SWIFT payment system, disruption of all sorts of kinds that we will have to think about and try to analyze today within a background of a world that was already tussling with the consequences of the pandemic, the supply chain bottlenecks, the persistence of zero COVID policy in China, of an effective closure in Hong Kong as well, of all sorts of travel disruptions, the impact obviously of the potential for a sovereign debt crisis, or at least set of restructurings around the world as a result of the overhang that's come from 2 years of pandemic, and of course the impact of potentially or very likely rising interest rates in dollar-based assets and others. So a lot of economic background was already there. Looking ahead, we would also be remiss in not acknowledging there are some political consequences beyond war, even if elections seem trivial alongside them. We have an election, presidential election coming up very, very shortly across the straits in the Republic of Korea, in South Korea, which will have consequences for Japan ROK relations. We have an election in the Philippines coming up. We have in Europe the French presidential election in April. And we have, of course, the upper house elections in Japan in July. And one would be foolish not to mention the American midterm elections in November, which will, if you like, round off the year. One of the striking things about the face-off with Vladimir Putin over Russia and Ukraine has been the divisions within the United States on this issue, with large parts of the Republican Party, or at least the sort of very conservative parts of the Republican Party, actually being, for the first time that I can remember, being supportive of Russia. And divisions are clearly there within, like, mainstream politics of the United States. And so we have to use that as our framework. So that's the somber but very interesting background to where we are. We absolutely are waiting to see also the Chinese reaction to, full Chinese reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is an invasion that comes with the background of the joint statement, the long joint statement between Russia and China, released on February the 4th, at the beginning of the Beijing Winter Olympics, when Vladimir Putin visited Beijing. A joint statement which declared that it was against interference in other countries' politics, declared that it was against the breaking of international rules and laws, and yet also condemned very much Western dominance of world affairs. So the Russia and China situation is the background to us. So that's the broad introductory background. I'm going to introduce our two speakers who, for this very wide-ranging situation that we have to grapple with, are excellent to have here. First of all, Robert Ward, who is the Japan chair of the IISS, as well as head of the Geoeconomics, Geopolitics and Strategy program. Robert joined the IISS in 2019 from the Economist Intelligence Unit, where he'd been editorial director for many years. And way back at the beginning of his career, he spent time in Japan from 1989 to 1996, firstly on the JET program, and then working for the Japan Bond Research Institute before then joining the EIU in London. We have also Yuka Koshino, who is the IISS Research Fellow for Security and Technology Policy, based in London. She has been at the IISS also for, well, the duration of the Japan program, which began when Robert arrived in 2019, as did Yuka shortly thereafter. Yuka was previously a research associate for the Japan chair at the CSIS in Washington, and she has been a Matsumoto Samata Fellow for the Asia Pacific Initiative, who collaborated also with our Japan program at the IISS. So without further ado, I'm going to hand on to Robert and Yuka to each give us their opening thoughts, about 10 minutes each, following which we will open up to Q&A in a discussion which I will also lead. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function at any time during the event, and I will endeavor to draw upon as many of them as I possibly can during the time available. I'm sure there's a lot to ask about. But meanwhile, Robert Ward, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction and that tour of the main points of the world. Thank you, Sarah, as well, and the BCCJ too for hosting us. Well, wake up this morning and obviously Russia invading Ukraine, and we've got 8 minutes or so each to sort of canter through the world. So to try and get everything in, we're going to do our best. Given that we've got 8 to 10 minutes, I will leave some things out. So if you've got things you want to talk about, please, between us, I'm sure we can field most of the questions that you may have. And I will touch on the Ukraine situation, what that means for Japan. at the end of my 3 bullet points. So I'm going to make these 3 bullet points, these 3 main points. One is just give you an overview of what I think is the outlook for the global economy in the next 2 years or so, 2022, 2023, and the key risks there. I think they're fairly clear, but they do need to be stated. And then give you a couple of thoughts on the US and China. As Bill said, the US has got midterm elections in November, and China's also got some politics going on. These are 2 critical interlocutors for Japan, of course. They're very relevant for everyone looking at Japan. And then give you some thoughts on geopolitics, which clearly will touch to a great degree on the Ukraine crisis. Before I start, I'm going to get this one slide. I've got one slide which we're going to put up, because I can't ever resist a bit of a leg stretch and to put where we are economically into context. It's always good to get a historical perspective. And those nice people at the World Bank give you global GDP data and Japanese GDP data right back to 1961. And just to give you some context about where we are, a couple of points here. One, when everyone talks about China and how brilliantly China did, I always like to remind people that before China did a China, Japan actually did a China back in the 1960s. And you can see that Japan's growth rate was outpacing the global growth rate by quite a nice healthy margin. Then in the 1980s, the sort of lift again with the bubble, and then the 1990s, the Japan's slightly less good performance, obviously, as after the bubble has collapsed. But the point I want to draw your attention to here is that since 2008, the world has lived through the most volatile economic period, probably since the end of the Second World War. If you look at the 2008 great financial crisis, the collapse there, and then you can't quite see it in the lines, but in between, I think 2012 and 13, the Eurozone sovereign crisis, which obviously hit Eurozone growth quite hard. And then we have the pandemic, which hit growth even more intensely. So the world is coming, we've all done pretty well, actually, I think, to get through this relatively unscathed. And obviously now we've got politics overlaying this too. But just to make the point that Japan in this pandemic wasn't hit as badly as some countries, for example, the UK, for all sorts of reasons, which we can talk about if you like, was hit worse in 2008 because of the big dependence on export markets, of course, and the sort of seizure of the world. But as you can see, the world is coming out of this crisis now, and Japan is lagging, unfortunately. It is in recovery period, as those of you that are there will know, but it is lagging behind the rest of the world and the rest of the developed economies as well, as has often been the case. If we get rid of that slide now, please. Thank you. So the world, Japan and the world go into 2022 into an economy that's actually a global economy that's actually quite difficult to navigate, sort of economically and politically, as I said. In historic terms, by the sort of standards of what we've had in the last couple of decades, global growth will be quite quick, but that doesn't mean we're in a boom, because we're recovering. We're in the sort of latter stages of the recovery. Last year growth was pretty quick, but this year growth at about 4%, and then next year back into the 3% for the world. For Japan, because we had a very strong fourth quarter, that gives a nice handoff into 2022, and growth is going to be about, I think, could actually notch up to about 3%. But that doesn't again mean a step change in Japanese growth. It means that it's all part of the recovery, and in next year and the year after, we're looking at growth into more sort of predictable 1%, perhaps just a little bit higher. What we're looking at is sort of evidence for Japan, of course, of Kishida's new capitalism, new economy. It sounds very good and sort of dovetails a bit with Xi Jinping's common prosperity. So of course, leaders everywhere are all want to sort of spread the dividends of growth and so on. But in Kishida's case, a little bit sort of difficult to sort of discern what exactly the precise contours of what this new capitalism are. One thing we'll be looking at to try and get a bit of a better handle on it is does he do anything in the labour market, particularly with regard to irregular workers in Japan, as you know. Regular workers make up a huge proportion of the labour force, and a lot of them women, a lot of them unstable, unsecure jobs. So if you can do something about that to give more security there, that will certainly be a good thing, but of course no evidence of that yet. And I think in terms of fiscal policy, I think pretty much as Abe did, even though Kishida is trying to disavow, put some sort of water between him and Abe, I think fiscal policy will remain pretty pragmatic, obviously dealing with the aftermath of the COVID crisis, and no change in terms of monetary policy. It's very difficult to see what Kuroda would do other than just keep the spigots on, certainly for the time being. In terms of risks, there's two risks, which I think Bill alluded to in the introduction. One, of course, is inflation. And I think this is a step change for the global economy, because we've been so used now for what, 2 decades or so, certainly since China started to impart disinflationary pressures into the world. We've been so used to prices remaining pretty steady. There was a piece in the Financial Times the other day saying that prices for some Japanese snacks had started rising for the first time since 1979, which I thought was extraordinary. So even in Japan, the inflationary pressures are being felt. In the US, inflation, I think in January was at 40% high. In the UK, inflation about 5-6%, that's at about 25% high. I'm just about old enough to remember the 1970s when inflation was 25% in the UK. So we're not quite there yet. But of course, for a lot of people, this will be a real shock. And I think a lot of policymakers have sort of lost the muscle memory in terms of how to deal with inflation, because it hasn't been such a big thing for so long. Why this is happening, in part, of course, because of this sort of bizarre recovery that we're having. Private consumption was sort of hemmed in by all the restrictions, government mandated restrictions, now being uncorked. So there's a lot of demand. Growth has been brisk, so the supply chains are finding it a bit difficult to cope with. Governments everywhere will be hoping that once things normalize and ships start appearing where they're supposed to be appearing and supply chains start normalizing, that that inflationary pressures will also come down. But I think the key to watch is inflationary expectations. So are inflationary expectations building, particularly in the US, which sets the tone for so much of the world's monetary policy? Are inflationary pressures building, getting more entrenched than governments would like? This means, of course, monetary tightening in the US, quite vigorous monetary tightening. I think 4 rate rises this year looks sensible. Perhaps taking the Fed funds rate next year to over 2%. Which would be quite a departure if that was sustained. And as Bill said, risks to emerging markets. Whenever there are interest rate rises in the US, that is always a risk for emerging markets, particularly badly managed ones like Turkey at the moment, with its very bizarre monetary policy, inflation running riot, yet they have negative interest rates, but also in the region, countries like Indonesia, which have their twin deficits, of course. Oil prices, again, as Bill mentioned, I think the Brent blend is at $102 a barrel, which is high. I'm certainly noticing it when I fill my car up. I think prices have gone up about 20% since last year, petrol prices. I looked at wheat just now. Wheat's at a 9-year high because Ukraine's such an important wheat supplier, of course. Even 3-month aluminium contract is now at a record high. So the issues in Ukraine are being felt pretty widely, in addition to the issues with the bottlenecks in terms of demand. If there is a benign outlook, then oil prices start to come down once things calm down and the recovery sort of reaches its end. But of course, given the uncertainties geopolitically, this is not necessarily a given. Second point, China and the US. Talk about US first. important midterms. Obviously, again, as Bill said, the midterms will set the tone for the 2024 presidential election. It looks likely that, not least because of historical precedent, that the Democrats will lose the House of Representatives. The Senate, obviously, again, always very, very tight, so too close to call. But if this does happen, then that makes Joe Biden, gives him a lot of difficulties in the final 2 years of his presidency. China also has a very packed political schedule this year. China's slowing. Growth, I think last year was 8%, this year going to be 5%, next year about 4%. China is structurally slowing, so don't believe the sort of hyperbole coming from the Chinese government about how China can grow at 6% forever. It can't. It's maturing, it's demographically, it's aging, it has productivity issues, it has debt issues, all the things that pull every single economy back down to ground. So China's having to deal with that. The two big political events for China that you must follow because they are so important. One is the March the 4th, 2 sessions, one of the annual meetings of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And they're going to be talking about economic and development plans the rest of the year. And then the really important one is the Autumn Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. Why is this important? Because it looks like it'll break with the tradition of handing power to the next leader after 10 years. Xi Jinping will have been in power for 10 years. We think he's going to stick around. He's given himself leeway to do that. So we're looking at changes in the Politburo, changes in the Politburo Standing Committee, what happens to the Premier Li Keqiang, and the big question for China Watch is that does he give himself the title of chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, which would sort of have very strong echoes of emulating Mao. And of course, for Japan, this year is the 50th anniversary of the normalization of Japanese-Chinese diplomatic relations, an important year for bilateral relations. Final point on geopolitics, the Ukraine invasion, one could talk about that for the entire session. Rather than do that, I'll try and relate it to what it means for Japan, is certainly in the first instance. And what's under threat here, of course, is the rules-based order, and a sort of any sort of semblance, if you like, that everybody subscribes to the rules-based order. Putin is trying to redraw the boundaries, the post-1989 boundaries in Europe. He's trying to create sphere of influence in that part of Europe. All things that will worry Japan, of course. Ukraine and Taiwan, they're not connected, but there are echoes, obviously, there. And I thought it very interesting where some in the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, are explicitly drawing connections between the security of Ukraine and the security of Japan. Not least, of course, because of the concerns about the Senkakus Islands down near Taiwan and China's broader revisionist efforts in the South China Sea and of course, in the East China Sea. So Japan will be looking at this very, very worried. It'll be under pressure from the G7, particularly from the US, as Bill said, ahead of this session. We'll be looking for some strong action from Japan. I think it's in Japan's interest to show that it does stand with the other democracies and to try to shed itself of some of the reserve that it may have had in the past, because this does have implications for Japanese security. And the final point I make is that given the threat to the rules-based order from this, I think what Japan has been trying to do, certainly since Abe, and Yuka and I talk about this in our forthcoming book, Japan's Effectiveness as a Geoeconomic Actor. What Japan has been trying to do to buttress the rules-based order, particularly in Asia, I think what's going on in Ukraine should draw more attention to that, and this sort of coalition building that Japan's been trying to do, and the sort of balancing Japan's been trying to do in China, in the region with regard to China, I think is even more important. So with that, I will leave it and hand back to Bill.
Thank you very, very much, Robert. Very, very comprehensive and thoughtful. And it is worth mentioning, just as an addendum to that Japan actually has some major energy investments in Russia, and could be confronted with like the Japanese equivalent of the Nord Stream 2 decision in Germany as a consequence of the invasion overnight. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Yuka Koshino, who is going to very much focus on Japan's strategic environment. Yuka, over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. So Robert very nicely laid out Japan's position in the global strategic environment. So I would try to lay out three things to look out from the security standpoint for Japan in 2022. So first is the developments around economic security, more specifically about the passage of the economic security related bills that will significantly improve the security of security relevant sectors in Japan, but also its own economic security as well. So when we talk about economic security, this idea, of course, as many of you listening into this call would have been following, it's not very new. It arises from this historical point of back in 1970s when Japan was facing the oil crisis and it was facing challenges on energy supply from the Middle East. It started to reduce the dependency from the region. And we've seen similar kind of approaches taken when Japan was shocked by China's use of economic coercion for the first time back in 2010, when China halted the export of critical minerals, rare earths to Japan to protest against Japan's detention of Chinese captain when there was a collision in the Senkakus Islands between the Chinese trawlers and the Coast Guard ships. So, but today the difference is that there is clear, specific strategic imperative behind Japan's recent discussion and buzz about the economic security. So today's economic security is driven from a clear geoeconomic challenges from China, and it's much rather than just focusing on reducing economic dependency and economic resilience. So as we've known from the legislation, there are 4 pillars to, which is much broader than what the specific narrow focus of economic resilience. The first is kind of the extension of what's already been discussed back in the end of 1970s. It's enhancing supply chain resiliency, but on critical minerals, medical goods, and batteries are really the new areas also outlined and following what the US thinks is important for supply chain resilience. And then the second is enhancing security of basic critical infrastructure. Basically, it means that restrictions on high-risk foreign suppliers, mainly from China. We've already seen that Japan has been wary about the economic and security espionages conducted by Chinese PLA-related attackers. Last year in April, Japan's Metropolitan Agency for the first time attributed Chinese PLA-affiliated hacker groups against Japanese space industries and JAXA. So that clearly shows that Japan's very wary of this, and this pillar is important to respond to it. And then the third element is keeping patents on sensitive technologies undisclosed. This is an effort to prevent technology outflow to China. And then the interesting element, the final element, is facilitating private-public cooperation on developing cutting-edge technologies. This is really important because you can see that Japan's economic security, I mean, it's more of keizanzei hosho, directly translated as economic security. It's not just looking at the defensive measures, but also trying to think about how to boost Japan's technology capabilities for future economic growth. So why this is significant, that this law allows the government to punish firms for the first time that does not follow these approaches taken by the Japanese government. So in that sense, I would say that various measures to enforce these efforts has already been in place in UK, US, or Germany. So in a way, Japan lags behind. But what is innovative and interesting and to look out for is that Japan takes a very interesting, innovative approach to institutionalize this idea of economic security. We've seen that Japan's National Security Council's Administrative Division, National Security Secretariat, has the economic division, and that is one of the largest division within the National Security Secretariat. We've also seen an interesting existing ministerial position, economic security minister, which sits above all the various ministries that will deal with economic security issues. Now, what's interesting is that this position was created basically to pass this legislation, but what will be interesting to watch is what role this minister will play in the future. We've seen Japan's also innovative approach on diplomatic scene as well. There was an announcement between US and Japan, economic 2+2, which will cover economic security areas. We haven't seen that the minister will actually attend his conferences, but after passing the legislation, whether this minister is going to promote economic security policy coordination across other like-minded partners in Europe and US is something to watch. And then a long-term question would be, how is Japan going to tackle its existing and long-lasting, I would say, historical kind of tensions between the interaction between the military defense groups and then the economic kind of groups. So Japan's very important part of Japan's innovation policy is Japan's Council for Science and Technology and Innovation, which sets out the rules, sets out the policies for Japan's future innovation in the medium term, but it does not include the defense minister in the discussion. So that also would raise the question of how effective would this Japan's approach would be if it wanted to respond to Chinese strategy of military civil fusion. And how effective can Japan actually respond to prevent the technology outflow? So the second point is that update of the Japanese security related policies. There's a series of security related policy that has been announced to be revised by the end of this year. The one important one would be revising Japan's first ever national security strategy, which lays out Japan's views on regional and security environment and its priority policy areas for the next 20 years. And then the second would be a national defense program guidelines, which lays out around 10 years of Japan's defense policies. And then a midterm defense plan, which will be the procurement plan for the next 5 to 10 years. So the number one priority issues we have observed is really about how Japan would respond to the missile threats. The drivers behind this is the growing missile threats and diversifications of missile threats from North Korea and China. We've already known that China already has been developing inter-range ballistic missiles, which could reach to US bases in Guam, but also over Japan. And not just that, but the hypersonic, China's increasing capabilities and operational capabilities of hypersonic missiles, which would be very difficult to detect and prevent under the current US-Japan missile defense systems. Not just China, but North Korea is also diversifying its missile capabilities, and it has claimed that it has tested hypersonics missile technologies earlier this year. So the first big question would be, and what the Prime Minister Kishida already mentioned, is whether Japan would possess a counter-strike capabilities, the so-called Tekikichi Kogeki Noryoku. This month, Defense Minister Kishi also expressed his thoughts that having Japanese aircraft enter the enemy base is possible under the legislation. So we can see how this discussion has been progressing in the government. But it is also important to not assess this. The assessment, though, is that it's important to know that it's a counter-strike capability. So it's a measure against the second, to prevent the second attack. So you can see that there are all sorts of different policies and legislation required and coordination between the United States to actually use its capabilities. But the decision to whether possess these capabilities or not would be a very important deterrence capability for Japan. The second question would be what kind of missile capabilities that Japan would possess to deal with the midterm and long-term threats from China that I just mentioned, which is the possessions of inter-range ballistic missiles and medium-range ballistic missiles, which will play a big role in any kind of crisis around Taiwan Straits. Is Japan willing, and is the Japanese public ready to host the US missiles in their own land, or is Japan going to develop its own missile capabilities is another big question. And then the second priority second questions around Japan's defense military buildup would be, to what extent Japan is actually going to invest in these capabilities. We've seen Japanese governments talk about boosting space-based capabilities, cyber capabilities, and electronics warfare capabilities, which is all the capabilities in new domains. But the big questions from the US and also other countries would be, how much, so is Japan going to scrap the 1% GDP defense investment, and what is actually it's going to, and what kind of signal it's going to send is another thing to watch. So these are domestic responses and capabilities development to look out for, but it's all very important also because of the context of the current geopolitical environment that Robert just mentioned, because especially when the US Biden administration, not just because the US and Europe is focused on the current situations in Ukraine and Russia, but also the essence of US Biden administration's integrated deterrence that has been launched from before this crisis happened, is to work closely with allies and partners, which means that Japan will be asked to answer tough questions, to share burdens, to maintain the free and open Indo-Pacific that it has been promoting. So the third final thing to watch out is the development of Japan's security relation with its ally, the United States, and its partner. The key questions to think about, to look out for this year would be whether Japan and the United States will, for instance, upgrade the defense guidelines that has been updated last time in 2015. There's lots of growing discussions that this guideline needs to be updated, not just to deal with the new domains, challenges in the new domains, but also to enable and clarify Japan, the division of labor between Japan and the United States in a contingency scenario. And then there's also growing partnerships, like how we have seen between UK and Japan. There were several industrial cooperation for joint development announced between UK and Japan over the past several months. And the UK and Japan are in discussions of negotiating a reciprocal access agreement. But within this current geopolitical environment and within this challenge in Europe, to what extent UK will be able to sustain its commitment in the Indo-Pacific region, and to what extent Japan could actually facilitate UK and European partners to remain committed in the region is something to watch. And then the final thing I think Bill mentioned and Robert mentioned as well will be the improvement of US ROK Japan relations. As we mentioned, we tend to talk a lot about China, but North Korea is one of the largest topics that has been discussed in the National Security Council over the past, since its establishment, and it's still the priority threat for Japan. So will these three countries actually cooperate is something to watch. So I think I'll stop my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Yuka, for that, and a very good outline of like the agenda for Japan legally and in terms of strategic planning and ultimately for defense spending. I will open now to questions. Please feel free to submit questions in writing in the Q&A function. If you put them in chat, I'm quite likely to see them, but it's not as easy within Q&A, so I do recommend using the Q&A function. I'm going to start the ball rolling by really focusing on the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what Japan's response can be, will be, should be. And I wonder if I could ask you both to focus again in a bit more on that and what the impact of the broad Western response to Russia could be on the global economy. I mean, first of all, Robert, how far do you think Japan will go with its sanctions and with its response to what Russia's done? And secondly, how big a factor should we consider the sanctions response and perhaps even cyber warfare that could well spread as a result of this as global economic risks?
Yes, Bill, that's good, excellent question. I think given the example of more sort of better sort of directed foreign policy that Abe set in his second term, I think there is quite a lot of expectation that Japan will do what it needs to do, certainly from the sort of inverted commas like-minded on sanctions. So I think there's quite a lot of pressure on Kishida to come out quite hard. His comment this morning that I read on his Twitter feed was quite timid, I thought. But as you said, Bill, before, he may be waiting for just to see what Biden's going to do and then act after that. There is pressure to do something quite effective, I think, given how big a threat to the rules-based order and particularly to European security, which obviously then affects is actually global security as well. So one would look perhaps for sanctions against some of the banks. The sanctions that Biden's announced so far were quite sort of nominal. In terms of what he did, I think he was leaving himself space just in case things got worse, which of course they have. And there are things that, of course, that he can do, particularly on the financial sector, which would have a significant impact on Russia. It's also interesting, and this is where Japan will come in again. Biden's trying to link up some of the electronics, the sort of tech countries, which Japan is one, to sort of starve Russia of high tech imports, which I think would be quite debilitating for Russia. In terms of what the backwash the other way, as you said, Bill, cyber attacks. I think we know that Russia is already very active in terms of its cyber aggression. The IISS has put out a report, which is up on the website for free on just evaluating national cyber power, and I think Russia is one of the countries that we looked at. So there is significant risk there, as there always has been. Clearly, again, with commodity prices, it's very difficult to forecast because an oil price is a complex cocktail of all sorts of different things, of which one thing is geopolitical risk, but there is sort of ample supply out there in terms of oil. So it'd be interesting to see what the Middle East might do if oil prices look like they were going to remain elevated for a long time. And also think the other thing we must think about is the humanitarian issue in Ukraine. Do we have refugees? Do we have population flows from the east of the country to the west of the country? What happens to the countries that border Ukraine in terms of how they cope? Poland, for example, which obviously, as we all know, has quite fraught relations with Russia, even at the best of times. So lots to think about. But to your original question, let's hope that Kishida does come out with something that has spine and has an impact.
Thank you, Robert, and a very, very good point about refugees, which I think does look like it'll be an important part of the aftermath of this. Yuka, perhaps quickly as an addition to Robert, you talked about the economic security law, and it's all were forthcoming. The pressure on Japan is to, in effect, implement some of that now, today, with vis-a-vis technology exports to Russia and so forth. Is the legal framework actually there to be able to, for Japan to respond to Ukraine in the way that it would like to? Yeah.
Right. I think Japan's economic security law, as I just made in my presentation, is really targeted against China. So I think when it comes to using other tools, geoeconomic tools, to respond to this current crisis, Japan, there are remaining questions about to what extent Japan is actually prepared. So that's a big question. At the same time, I think Robert laid out a lot about how Japan is trying to respond to the specific crisis. But I think as Robert and we all, I both mentioned in our presentations, the big kind of strategic goal that Japan is trying to pursue is to maintain a free and open international rules-based international order. And in that sense, shifting Japan's attention all to Russia and the Ukraine crisis is going to create further challenges in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that there's a lot that Japan can actually do more to prevent further challenges to the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region, and in the geographically much closer areas like Southeast Asia. We've already seen challenges of what's going on right now in Myanmar and various responses to it, and Japan's unique response, for instance, try to kind of become a broker in the region. And those efforts, I think, is going to be really important to prevent further challenges to the rules-based order. I think another thing that maybe Japan can play a role in this would be, there's a lot of questions around to what extent China and Russia is actually cooperating and actually aligning. And because of the proximity to China, Japan has a lot of the intelligence around, and Japan can provide assessments on China's ability. For instance, there's, as Robert mentioned, there's a lot of questions around, how connected this will be in China's any kind of actions in the Taiwan contingencies. But I think Japan can contribute to whether PLA is actually ready to do that in terms of capabilities and operational readiness. And so those are, I think, looking at the big pictures, Japan, there's a lot of roles that Japan can play, and more closely and more on the China front.
Thank you. And so that comes straight into some of the questions that are coming in. David Bickle from BCCJ has asked, how will the unfolding of events in Ukraine have impacted on Japan's contingency planning for acts of aggression by China with respect to Taiwan? And in addition, he's asking, what are the efficacy of sanctions as a deterrent versus, or rather as a punitive measure? Do you think, perhaps starting with you, Yuka, the contingency planning, will this be materially altered by what we're seeing in Ukraine, from Japan's point of view?
I think from Japan's point of view, and also not just Japan, but when we talk about that any contingency in Taiwan, it's also going to be U.S.-Japan cooperation. And over the past several years, I'm hearing from kind of interlocutors in DC, the discussions on contingency planning has been starting to develop, and there's growing need. And the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is also based on and I would say that the pulling out of the U.S. troops in Middle East also suggests that Indo-Pacific is really core of U.S. current strategy, and that will not be significantly altered from the U.S. perspective. It's not significantly going to be altered by what's going on in the region. So I think there's room for Japan and U.S. to continue to try to mature this contingency planning. But I think what Japan and U.S. needs to think about in calculation is the recent military engagements from outside of the region, including UK's CARE Strike group and the permanent deployment of vessels, and then European ships and vessels, and to what extent that Japan and U.S. can maybe rely on these military partners and allies and partners outside the region is something that will probably factor in when they think about the contingency planning.
Thank you, Yuka. And Robert, David asks, sanctions, are they effective as a punishment, or are they a deterrent? What's your evaluation of what sanctions can do? And of course, Russia is prepared quite substantially for the future, for the prospect of sanctions with its $600 billion of foreign exchange reserve. How do you evaluate the sanctions situation?
So, if I can just quick coda to what Yuka said on Taiwan, then come to sanctions. There's a debate in the sort of Japan watching community. Has Japan's policy towards Taiwan changed? And some say no, it hasn't, because Japan's always wanted inverted commas stability in the Taiwan Strait. I think what has changed, though, and I think this will give a sort of extra tailwind to that, is the politics around how Japan views Taiwan, linking it specifically, explicitly to Japan's own security. And I think the LDP is trying to sort of prepare the population for the big changes. You can mention the sort of increases in defense spending, for example. There's going to be need to have more research and development, and also quite big policy changes. I think this is a sort of tailwind for those in the LDP that want to see these changes to try and sort of push that political change a bit faster. On sanctions, Russia is a sort of an odd beast, really, in the sort of global economy, because it is, if you look at it, it's very fiscally, for example, fiscally conservative. So runs a budget surplus, obviously because oil prices have been high. That's been very positive for the current account position as well. You mentioned, Bill, that foreign exchange reserves have gone up, which they have. I read this morning that it's managed to reduce its holdings of US treasuries to try and reduce its vulnerability there and increase holdings of Japanese assets, actually, and also Eurozone assets as well. So Russia is kind of what we call a sort of fortress economy. The population is pretty battle hardened. Don't particularly like it, I imagine, not being able to get certain items from abroad, but they are quite battle hardened. I think the issue there's on sanctions is the financial sector that really needs to be tackled here to really have an effect. And one is, what banks in Russia do you target? I think Share Bank is it that processes a lot of Russian wages and pensions. That would need to be targeted to have a real impact. I saw today. So there are things that can be done, but Russia has been living with sanctions for a very long time now. I think it's the largest country that's ever been targeted by sanctions, and it has been living with them. So it's not like sanctioning a much smaller country, which is much more vulnerable. But there are things that can be done, and one would hope, as we said earlier, that they will be forthcoming given the seriousness of what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, indeed. Now, Duncan Bartlett, who is from SOAS China Center, has asked very much further about China. He says, thank you for your excellent presentations. Both the speakers touched on Japan's concern about Chinese expansionism in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, as well as the issue of the Senkaku Islands. Could they offer their assessment of the risks of Chinese military action near the Senkakus? What do you think the risks are, Yuka, and have they changed?
Sure. I think just giving the number of Chinese naval vessels and even vessels and also aircrafts operating around the air identification zones and above the Senkaku Islands shows that there's always risks for unexpected risks for tensions, military tensions to arise. So that is, of course, something that Japan needs to watch, and that is another rationale that Japan is investing, Japanese self-defense forces investing more in the southwestern islands near the East China Sea. But in terms of actual kind of specific military action, I would say that a lot of the, I think the observers have a consensus that China's kind of any kind of invasion, if it happens in the East China Sea or the Senkaku Islands, will be associated with the conflicts and contingencies that will happen in Taiwan. So I think it's really important to look at this in a larger kind of strategic rationale behind how would China want to attack the Senkaku Islands. It will be associated with the Taiwan scenario.
Right. Yes. No. Well, thank you very much for that. Now, Graham Davis, who is a former colleague from the Economist Group for Robert and myself, asks a question. He says, COVID was bad enough and has lasted a lot longer than many anticipated, but for many sectors, the impact has been manageable. In terms of the time it will take and the impact it will have, what are your expectations for Ukraine? Impossible question, but what are your best guesses about the economic impact of the Ukraine crisis? It depends on all sorts of scenarios that one could go through, but we're now seeing a pretty full-on scenario. So, Robert, how do you go about trying to put your arms around this?
Well, hello, Graham. Nice to see you. Thank you for attending. Ukraine, one of the things that's gone wrong with Ukraine, in my view, is that it's been an economic weakling verging on basket case for quite a long time. And I think there was a hit very badly in the financial crisis of 2008. Lots of corruption, lots of poor governance, and so on. And I think that was a missed opportunity, really. Things have changed over the last few years a little bit, but Ukraine, I think, missed an opportunity to really stabilize its economy, and to open the door to even more investment and so on. The interesting connection there is between Ukraine and China, because they do quite a lot of trade, certainly in terms of Ukraine's composition of Ukraine's trading basket, I think on wheat and things. So China's built up quite a strong relationship with Ukraine. But clearly, if this country is going to end up, it was one of the big risks here in terms of there's obviously multiple scenarios. But if this country is going to end up in a sort of frozen state, like a sort of frozen conflict, which may suit Putin quite well, because if Ukraine is in this sort of frozen conflict state, it can't really develop. It's permanently unstable. It can't really go one way or the other. But obviously, Putin then holds even more of the upper hand. If that's the case, then obviously the economic outlook for Ukraine is very bleak indeed, because it won't get the reform. Obviously, I get the reconstruction from the damage caused by the violence, but it won't get the reforms, the investment, and so on that it so badly needs. But I think there was, over the last 10 years, been a missed opportunity in really sort of upgrading Ukraine's economy, and I think that's I think the policymakers will sort of regret that looking forward.
And what about for the world economy? Of course, you touched upon this in your presentation, but what, as it were, is the worst case scenario economically on the basis of what we know about the invasion, as far as the knock-on effects for global growth and the sort of numbers that you were citing from, if you like, pre-war forecasts?
Yes, well, Ukraine's not integrated into the global economy, unlike, say, if you compared and contrasted what the impact on Taiwan would, if something happened, contingency in Taiwan, I think the impact would be quite different. But that said, I mean, Ukraine is a major wheat exporter. I think it used to be a big steel exporter as well. Clearly, it's in a strategically vital bit of the sort of Eurasian landmass as well. So any spillover into other bits of, around the Black Sea, for example, or into Europe, as is certainly one risk. The countries around Ukraine also see some destabilization. So there are sort of quite a few sort of points of risk. I think for, in the immediate term, it must be around what happens to commodity prices. The world economy, as I said, is coming through. It's a very strange recovery. To me, it doesn't feel like recovery, really. It feels like sort of normalization, even though growth rates are so rapid. But the world economy is still quite fragile. Inflation, monetary policy tightening for the first time in a very long time. So labor markets looking quite odd. A lot of businesses have gone bust, a lot of new ones are coming, but there's a lot of sort of transition in the global economy at the moment. And the last thing it needs is a prolonged period of high oil prices. OPEC plus Russia have done a pretty effective job of controlling production and sort of keeping the sort of the floor on oil prices, just keeping them elevated. It'd be interesting to see sort of final point as to what happens with that particular relationship if high oil prices look like they're going to be damaging the global economy, if they look sustained.
Thank you. Final question, which we only have 1 minute to answer, really, but I think we should nevertheless very much address it. A second question from David Bickle about Japan's economic security. Is it well served, he asks, by seeking to develop indigenous capability across a broad range of military technologies, or would it be better to buy off the shelf from allies and instead devote energy to being a global leader in other tech niches? How do you, in a very brisk way, how do you think about that, Jukka, about really the best use of Japan's resources in this?
Right. If I have only 1 minute, I would just emphasize the fact that even when Japan has a very capable dual-use technologies, because of the policy and politics and the legal and the sentiment in the public, it's very difficult to apply for the militaries. There are new fundings in the Ministry of Defense to fund emerging technologies for potential military use, but the universities have refrained from receiving because of it's a kind of rejection to be associated with military relevant technologies. So I would be a bit hesitant to say that Japan doesn't have capabilities and just need to buy off the shelf from allies. For instance, Japanese commercial and civilian 5G technologies could actually be used for military application overseas. So I would just say that structurally and politically, there are challenges for Japan's full kind of military application of these technologies.
Well, thank you very, very much to both Yuko Koshino and Robert Ward for giving us very, very thought-provoking tour of this horizon on this really rather sobering and momentous day. We don't know whether the global payment system will be fractured by the end of the day. We don't know what will happen to oil prices. We don't know what's going to happen to gas and all sorts of other energy investments. It's a day of great uncertainty, and we've started it at least in the UK time and finished it in the Japanese time with a very, very excellent framework for how to think about it and how to think of Japan's position within this evolving scene. So I want to thank the British Chamber of Commerce in Japan for collaborating together with the IISS and the Japan Society of the UK. And I want to thank all of those who've attended this conference, whether in Japan or in the UK or indeed elsewhere, for your support. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. And a final renewed thank you to Yuko Koshino and Robert Ward. And a final mention to say, I think all three of us are going to get to Japan very soon. And we look forward to seeing you all when we do. Have a great evening in Japan and a great day in Europe.